Good evening. I wanted to welcome everybody to a Jewish Community Relations Council community conversation. It is my pleasure. I'm Kathy Gardner. It is my pleasure to serve as the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Dayton. We have a very interesting and important conversation this evening, and I want to thank all of our panelists. I also wanted to take this opportunity to remind everybody of the commitment that the Jewish Community Relations Council believes in, and that is to educate, advocate, and act. So with that, I want to also introduce to you our new team member here. We have a new JCRC director, as we have had to say goodbye to Marcy Paul as she takes on a different position. Chen Sterenbach is joining us as the JCRC Senior Director. He's getting his feet wet, and we look forward to you meeting all of you to meet him. So, Chen, if you would introduce yourself, and we'll get the show on the road.
Hi everyone, my name is Chen Sterenbach, and I just moved to Dayton a month ago, and it's amazing to be here, and I have learned a lot in the month or so that I've been here, and it's a great honor to be part of the community. And now I will introduce Marcy.
Hi everyone, good evening, Erev Tov. I am honored to be the moderator for this evening's JCRC Community Conversations. In addressing the recent Supreme Court decision, JCRC reflected on several approaches that would benefit us as a Jewish community. Dayton's JCRC commitment to educate, advocate, and act provided the groundwork for tonight's program, When Does Life Begin? Can we ask everyone to mute, please? Thank you. We are pleased to have three of our rabbis with us tonight. Rabbi Karen Bodney Hallis of Temple Israel.
Okay, I'll turn that off and I'll be right up. I'm picking this up because I need to type. I'll bring this out later.
Rabbi Aubrey Glazer Wartzman of Beth Abraham, and Rabbi Nachum Mangel of Chabad of Greater Dayton. In addition, retired magistrate Bonnie Beeman Rice will offer a response in understanding the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision for the Jewish community. Please understand that there are many perspectives that we each bring to this community conversation. JCRC is convening this conversation so that we may educate ourselves and each other, and for this, I am truly grateful. Some logistics as usual. Because of our large participation this evening, this community conversation will only feature our panelists, and all attendees will and should be muted. Thank you very much. We will have time for a Q&A. Please write your questions in the Q&A box. The chat is disabled. We have asked the rabbis to respond to the questions in alphabetical order, and our time is really limited, so I may have to interrupt so we can move forward, so I apologize ahead of time. So let's begin. Rabbis and Bonnie, would you like to come back on and show us yourselves? So we're going to begin with our first question. And the first question will start with Rabbi Bonnie Hallis. When does life begin? How do we know this? And what resources do you go to help you understand this?
Here's Aubrey's phone in case Tel calls.
I think everyone's muted now. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I know time is of the essence, so I will try to talk quickly. I think it's important for us to recognize that the reason why we start with this question and any topic of related to abortion is because the texts, I believe, are there to help establish that, according to the text, the fetus is not of equal standing as a mother, And those are related to what I see as four arguments that are talking about when does life begin in respect to its status compared to the mother. So I often go first to the argument of, it comes from Leviticus 24:17, looking first at the biblical text, where it talks about if anyone kills any nefesh adam, any human being, he shall surely be put to death. This is in relationship to Genesis 2:7, which tells us God formed the human, ha'adam, from the dust of the earth, afar min ha'adamah, blowing into his nostrils the breath of life, the human became a living being. When we talk about nefesh adam, we look specifically as to understand that God's breath of life is what turned the dust into nefesh, putting full person humanhood at that first moment of breath. In this sense, that's when life begins, or at least when this is going to say that the breath of life, the soul has entered. We also see that again in later text with the Nida 44b. The second argument that I normally look at is looking specifically at some of the damages that are looked at in Exodus 22 through 25. In the Bible, if someone accidentally causes a miscarriage to take place, they then become obligated to pay financial damages only, rather than a life for life. Again, reinforcing the idea that feticide is not the same as homicide. Again, making a comparison between when life begins. I believe as well that, let me find my second piece. Paper. We look specifically also at Numbers 5 on that one as well, that I'm not going to go there. The third argument that I like is looking at the idea of when does life begin, in that Judaism, I believe, tells us that life does not begin at conception, but there is an opportunity for us to say that there's potential life that is increased, especially after the 40 days. We're taught in some of the later text with Yevamot 69b10, telling us about how a fetus remains as potential life, this Maya Ba'alma. Jewish law will then count 40 days as beginning at conception, which is different actually from how we do this in modern medical practice, which counts from the last menstrual cycle. We're also taught in Yevamot, that's the same one. It's Mishnah Nida. It says, if a woman miscarries on the 40th day, she need not be concerned that there was offspring. For on the 41st day, she sits for both a male and a female. As for menstruant, talking about, the context is on losing a child. The last argument, and I'll talk quickly, is looking at the fetus to show that it is not an independent being and that it is still part of the woman's body until birth. Again, looking specifically at Talmud Gittin, where it's told by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, a fetus is considered as its mother's thigh, as part of its mother's body. There are others as well, but I think that's probably 6 minutes. I haven't looked at my clock. So I think you're muted.
Thank you very much. Rabbi Glazer Wartzman.
Thank you, Marcy, and thank you, Rabbi Karen. And I look forward to also not only learning more from you as well as from Rabbi Mangel. It's wonderful to be here as part of this conversation. And I would just really want to add a little bit to the great sources that you've brought, many of which are on my go-to list. And I think that when we have this conversation, I'll answer the question in a moment, but part of what is really important is to realize this question is contextual in many, many ways. And it's so great to have female clergy here to be with us to give that perspective in terms of context. I think it's really incredibly important. And the larger issue, Kathy sent out a very interesting article from the president of JOFA, and just the whole issue of the competing values that we're struggling with here that I want to put on the table. On the one hand, pru or vu, the idea of having progeny in the Jewish community is considered to be a mitzvah, a command of great importance. And so is the accessibility and the freedom for women to be able to decide and to have the autonomy over their own reproductive rights. The sources that Rabbi Karen shared with us, I think, are illustrative, and there are many, many more that we could bring to bear. But we need to understand that there are competing values, that every life is sacred, and that there's a difference between potential life and actual life. That's something that she brought up that I think is really important to remember. In Tannaitic literature, early rabbinic literature, there is an extension between 41 and 80 days, according to different sages, in terms of when that potential life moves from potentiality to actuality. And the issue that I wanted to bring up, though, is aside from on the one hand, the importance of having progeny as being a major value for continuity in Jewish life, as well as reproductive freedom and autonomy for women to be able to make those decisions of their own volition in consultation with rabbinic authorities, the issue of shaming that has emerged in the community is one that we really have to deal with, that no woman should be shamed for her need to be able to access these technologies and the advice that she needs to be able to make her own informed decisions. And that was something that came up in the article by the president of JELFA that I think we have to remember. So we have competing values of the value of life, of potential life, the importance of the dignity to be me'orevet lechol habriot. We have to really be understanding that we're in part of a context with someone's life, specifically the life of the mother, which takes precedence over the fetus in any potential life. And I'll just close with something that I turn to quite often, a remarkable source known as the Sitz Eliezer, blessed memory, Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, who was not only a Dayan and in the Supreme Rabbinical Court in Jerusalem, but he was an eminent authority in medical halacha and the rabbi of the Shaarei Tzedek Medical Center in Jerusalem. And at the end of one of his very interesting responsa, he suggests that it's valid to be, depending on the specific context that I'm not going to go into, but he says that in a case where a child will be born deformed or in constant pain, that he says we should make a heter to permit an abortion within 40 days of conception, which is what we were just speaking about, 40 to 41 days. And at the most, this is shocking to many of us, up to 3 months, providing that the fetus is not moving. So there's an incredible sense of leniency. And when we're in the space of dealing with medical experts and integrating current medical knowledge, not just what was written in Galen's treatise and what was going on in the Greco-Roman Empire that early rabbinic texts are responding to, we have to take into account, from my perspective, what current medical knowledge shares with us about in reaffirming these notions of the safety of the mother, and that ultimately the potential life of the fetus up until that range that Sitz Eliezer sets up between 40 days and up to 3 months, until that point, if it poses any kind of danger to the mother, physiological, psychological, or economic or otherwise, that fetus, that potential life, is considered to be a rodef, which means that the mother has to be protected at all costs. And so granting that access to women is obviously, from my perspective, very much first and foremost as a priority, as well as understanding that people have different ways of being able to contribute to the Jewish community in terms of fulfilling the equally important command of having progeny and continuity. And it's not just a focus on biological progeny. I think that's one of the things that that leads to some of the shaming that goes on in the community, which I think needs to be repaired, is that there are many ways that we can express our connection to progeny and continuity, not just by biological progeny, but through adoption, by supporting students, by being good mentors and teachers, big brothers. There's lots of ways and sisters that we can do that. But there are competing values that are at stake here. It's important to know the context, and it's important to be abreast of the most up-to-date medical knowledge by medical professionals. And in the case where we have dayanim and legislators who are deeply immersed in the halachic literature, the rabbinic literature, understanding the precedent that Rabbi Karen started to bring forward to us, and seeing the flow of how that moves into our own current environment, in line with advances in medical technology, it's very, very important to be able to bring that to bear with this question. And as I mentioned, that leniency is one that I think is extremely important. And when I counsel people, it's always contextual. So I think it's something that's important.
We'll get to that question in a little bit. Thank you, Rabbi. Rabbi Mengel.
Okay, thanks for having me, and thanks for organizing this event. Surprised that nobody told a joke that you usually hear talking about this conversation. When does life begin? About the priest, the minister, and the rabbi that we're discussing. When does life begin? And the priest answers at the moment of conception. The minister answers at birth, and the rabbi answers when the children finally leave to college. That's when life finally begins. So sorry to add some levity to a serious conversation. Thanks, both rabbis. When I was studying in yeshiva, it was often that our teacher, our mentor, would say something, and then we would ask, but 1 minute, Rabbi. Yesterday, you taught us something that seemed to contradict what you just said. It seems that there's an inconsistency here. And often the answer was in Yiddish, es wenzach vu meret. It depends what you are talking about. That you always have to look and see the nuance and the difference between the different issues that we are discussing. That on the surface, two statements of the Talmud might seem to say the same thing. However, when you look closer, you can see they're talking about two different subjects. So the context is extremely important as well. And when you look at the context of both of those statements, often you would find that it's not a conflict and a contradiction at all. And at the same time, when we were studying for our smicha, for our ordination, we were taught that when you are asked a question, that you must understand the subject matter thoroughly. And that is by first you must begin from the Torah itself, from the 5 books of Moses, to understand the issue, how it is addressed in the Bible and the Torah itself, studying the commentaries, the classic commentaries on the passage. Then you look at the Mishnah and the Talmud and its commentaries, and then you must look at the codes to see how the codes develop the law. You look at Maimonides, you look at the Bet Yosef, who had an understanding of all of the issues and its entire breadth and scope of any one issue, and then to see how they decided this law. And then that was not enough. Then you have to look at the responsa to see how the rabbis throughout the ages took this knowledge and applied it to real life situations. It's one thing to talk about an issue that is theoretical, that very often you will find in the Talmud. It talks about theoretical questions, but there's another issue when you are dealing with somebody's life, a woman's life, a family's life. And there you turn to the responsa to see how they actually answered specific questions dealing with specific people and circumstances. And the same thing when we're talking about the issue of abortion and when does life begin. It is a serious issue. And as I tell people often, that Judaism doesn't lend itself to buzzwords, slogans, and headlines, especially when we're talking about delicate and sensitive issues that are dealing with people's lives. Only Hillel can answer a question while standing on one foot. I cannot. So when discussing this issue of when life begins, we must ask ourselves in what context are we asking this question? And there can be different answers based upon the context of the question, as was mentioned earlier. So when we are dealing with the issue of the penalty of taking life, then there can be one answer, that a child and a fetus, as was said previously, in the mother's womb, is not considered an independent, self-sufficient life. And therefore, if you end that life, it does not deserve a death penalty, as if you take any living being walking independently on the earth. The same thing would be if the fetus is threatening the life of the mother. So then you have to ask, is it equal to the mother's life, or is it different than the mother's life? And then there might be one answer. As we will look at the issue of Rodef, as Rabbi Glazer mentioned, you will look at the issue, is it an equal life, as Rabbi Karen mentioned. But then there's another perspective that you can look at this whole issue, and that is from the perspective of the soul, the perspective of God. So we are asked to emulate, imitate God, and to create a better world, to perfect the world through acts of kindness, generosity, and justice and fairness. Now, what act can we perform as human beings that is the closest to God? That is the creation of a new human being. The mystics tell us that God created the universe ex nihilo, something from absolute nothing. The same thing is the creation of a child. When you consider what goes in versus what comes out, there is a sperm and an egg, but what is produced? A sophisticated, intelligent human being with a mind and a heart. The mystics tell us this is the closest that we can ever get to God.
Thank you. We have to, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to stay on time here. So you'll have a moment in a minute. So I find it fascinating that we talked about from all three of our rabbis, context, nuance, theoretical direction or theoretical stance. So I guess it's fascinating because overarching the issue is the life of the mother, the priority of the mother. And so I go back and Rabbi Glazer Wartzman referred to this in his response to the first question about medical halakha. So I ask all three of you, beginning with Rabbi Glazer Wartzman, under what circumstances can or should a pregnancy be terminated when we think of the mother as priority?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to respond. I'll build on the other Rabbanim that are here because there's so much rich Torah that is emerging and the conversation is getting richer and richer. We could study this for a few years together. We only have a minute to respond. I would turn to Mishnah Ohalot 7:6 that says, specifically, if a woman's labor becomes life-threatening, then the fetus can actually be dismembered in her womb and taken out limb by limb, because her life always comes before. Mipnei shechayeha kodmim lechayav. Her life always comes before the life of the fetus. Once most of the child has emerged, most of the child here, and this is again an issue that comes up in later codes, yatsa rubo, if the most of the child has emerged, it's not to be touched because one life is not supposed to be put aside for another. So that's part of what the precedent that Rabbi Mangel was referring to, just going and flipping back very quickly to an early Mishnaic source from around 200 CE, and then toggling forward to the Tzitz Eliezer, who then is looking at these kinds of precedents, which I draw on, and says, depending on the context, and again, this is contextual, but if there is any kind of concern that the child will be born deformed or in constant pain, the Tzitz Eliezer is very clear. If the Vlad, it doesn't say a human being, it says a Vlad, which really is, there's a whole literature about Yetzirat HaVlad, the formation of the fetus, which is really another interesting conversation. But in the legal texts, where as opposed to the lore, it says if it comes out as a Baal Mum or a Baal Yisurim, if it is deformed or in constant pain, we should permit an abortion within 40 days of conception up to 3 months. So you see the way the law has evolved from the extreme leniency and also the primitive state of medical knowledge and science in the time of the Mishnah, all the way up to the 20th century at Shaare Zedek Hospital. That to me is an astonishing moment of aha, to say that the conversation continues. We draw on the precedents, but we're not limited by the precedents. We have to, as most legislators know, you have to do what Chai Gaon said, Puk Chaze. Go out and see what's happening, specifically with the mother, with the hospital, with medical science, and apply the precedent to the context of the situation to be as compassionate and to retain as much dignity and freedom of the mother as possible.
Thank you. Thank you. Rabbi Mengel.
So of course, as mentioned, the life of the mother is always primary. And the Tzitz Eliezer does talk about the future life of the child to be born. There is quite a bit of discussion amongst contemporary rabbis of what that means. And I think that we have to be careful because we also don't want to stigmatize children with special needs that are not born perfect, as somebody might consider that a healthy child looks this way and speaks this way and acts this way. So then here becomes the conversation of what do we consider a child that can endanger the life of the mother? And here you have many rabbis who are more lenient and others that are stricter. You have a body of law that talks about a child who will be born with Tay-Sachs and no real chance of living beyond a very short period of time. It can be extremely painful. The criterion that I would use is, again, these issues have to be consulted. A rabbi and the doctor and the family, and sometimes there has to be a mental health professional that has to be there as well to understand of what is the consequences of ending the pregnancy or continuing the pregnancy. So if it is clear that if it's endangering the health of the mother and mental health is considered a threat to the mother's life, so then you can end the pregnancy. But we have to be very careful to say that just because a child will be born with some type of deformity, that is a good enough reason to end that potential life, because it will cause pain to the parents, to society, or to the child itself.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. And Rabbi Bani Hallis, please. You
I was
muted.
just sorry. Thank you. And I want to just thank my colleagues for their insightful comments. The only other text that I think I would bring into this, we've already established sort of the issue of the Rodef briefly. I think Rabbi Mengel had talked about this, where we're seen to have a child or a fetus, I should say, that is seen as an aggressor to the mother and is in danger of harming her in the sense that it would bring about immediate or imminent death. One of the things that is very important when we talk about the nuancy is looking at sort of the issue in my mind of when we ask about the question of whether we have a right to choose, it becomes very challenging because of the fact that in traditional Judaism, we don't have the choice of what to do with our body in the sense that it belongs to God. So under what circumstances are we able to, again, put this into perspective so that there is a value, there is importance there. But we understand, at least, I was looking also at the Tzitz Eliezer, and the question of having something such as Tay-Sachs, which is something that will be horribly painful and lead to eventual death, not eventual, but you know what I mean. We see that there are other texts that also help to push forward the question as to expand it to other situations. And so there are some authorities who would differ about whether or not the fetus has to be the proximate cause of danger to the mother's life when we're talking about danger. And if we look at Rabbi Aaron Aharon Lichtenstein, he says that there is an opportunity, if you will, He says, I don't want to say opportunity, it's the wrong terminology, but there is an opening in it. Where is it? That there are other ethical and humane factors that should be taken into account. It seems to me that issues such as kavod habriot, the dignity of persons, shalom bayit, domestic peace, and sa'ar, pain, which all carry significant halachic weight in their context, should be considered in making these decisions. I think as well, there is another opportunity where we talk about when a woman can actually make a choice that someone else has made a different choice for when it comes to eating food, and whether or not she has been given the opportunity to make that choice for her. If someone else says this food is going to cause you to be ill, or this food is going to cause the fetus to be ill, she then has the opportunity to override that because it is her body to decide whether or not she's going to eat. And so again, looking at where does the choice begin? At what point is this something that is going to hold in balance those values, in addition to the question of when life begins, as well as understanding and recognizing that having a right to choose is not necessarily the right question.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to move now to Bonnie Beeman-Rice, who is our legal expert with this. And the first question we want to ask Bonnie is, how did Roe and its progeny address the issue of when life begins?
Okay, so what I'd like to do is just start with a bird's eye view of what the legal underpinnings were, which I'll do very briefly, and then address the issue from kind of a ground point perspective of what they talked about, if at all, about when life begins. And Roe versus Wade, which was decided in 1973, addressed a Texas law that had been passed which prohibited abortion at any stage of pregnancy. And the plaintiff filed her claim, a pregnant woman who wanted to seek an abortion, filed her claim on the basis of the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution. And that amendment reads in part, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, liberty being the key word here, or property without due process of law. And the Supreme Court in the Roe case held that liberty interest, that part of the 14th Amendment had an implied right of privacy, not explicit, but implied, that meant that a person should have the right to make choices about one's body and one's life without government interference. So this right of privacy under Roe was announced that a woman had the most personal decisions, the right to terminate a pregnancy if she so chose. But the right was not absolute. There were two interests at stake, both that of the mother and that of the fetus. And so the court did a balancing act, and they did that by setting up a framework using trimesters during the pregnancy. And during the first trimester, it was held that the state may not interfere with the woman's right to choose to get an abortion. And towards the end of the second trimester, when the fetus became viable, which means it could live outside the mother's womb, at that stage, at 28 weeks at the time, based on the medical knowledge, the state did have a right to prohibit abortions and regulate them. So in this case, the state of Texas had argued that the fetus is a person and that life begins at conception. And so the Supreme Court addressed both those contentions, and it pointed out first that you really don't have to start at conception. The state did not have to go to such an extreme argument because as long as there was a potential life involved, the state had an interest in protecting rights beyond those of the mother. But most interestingly, in addressing the personhood question, the state said the 14th Amendment and the Constitution really doesn't define the word person anywhere in its context. And the way that the court has applied the word person has been postnatally. So one of their first holdings was that the person as used in the 14th Amendment does not include the unborn. The second thing that they did was Justice Blackmun, who wrote the decision, made the following statement about when life begins. He said, "We need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins. There has always been strong support that life does not begin until live birth. and he references some historical narratives and also the view of the Jewish faith. So in this regard, he indicates that the state has a valid interest in protecting potential life. They do not actually address when life begins because that is part of that privacy right for women to decide to some extent. But under the right of privacy, a woman had a right to abortion within the first trimester and up until the end of the 28 weeks. A subsequent case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, affirmed Roe, affirmed that decision. They changed a couple of things. They did not use the trimester framework. Rather, they used a viability analysis saying that up until the time of viability, abortion should be available. And they relied on an individual liberty interest, not relying so much on privacy, but on liberty. And basically, the Casey court held that the state can have legitimate interest in regulating abortion, but until the time of viability, the woman has a right under the liberty interest to an abortion. And then when they address the issue of when life begins, the author of the majority opinion wrote, in defining the liberty interest on which the woman's right to abortion is grounded, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of life. Beliefs defining the attributes of personhood can't be formed under the compulsion of the state.
Wow. So I guess the question is, and I'm supposed to stick to our set questions, but wow, I wish we could go on for hours with this, as you all stated. So how do we navigate this, rabbis? How do we navigate what the law tells us and what the government law tells us and our Jewish law tells us? How do we navigate that when we have that family in front of us, sitting in our office, wanting to understand what to do and how to do it? And I'm sorry, Rabbi Mangel, you start, please.
I'm not sure that it is really a contradiction. Not that I celebrated or cried in 1973 or at the latest ruling, because I don't think that Judaism is consistent with either extreme, one side or the other. I think that it's Jewish approach is a lot more nuanced, as we can see from our discussion here today. So I'm really not sure how it would be a conflict today. It means I think as a rabbi, I can guide an individual, a family, or a couple, regardless of what the situation is here today. That means the option is still out there if it's necessary, and if it's not necessary, so then I don't know how the law infringes on our Jewish right.
Okay, thank you. Rabbi Bodney Hallis.
To me, this is a pastoral issue because there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, and also regret and guilt that comes from all of the questions being asked of an individual. And I think that when, we've been taken away from this opportunity to have the opportunity to make the choices with our consultation, that we feel even more pressure, that our choices are more limited. And so dealing with that in a pastoral opportunity, allowing someone to articulate those fears and concerns and helping them to navigate through them helps me, at least, to look to the texts that I feel are going to help resonate to answer the questions that they're having, but ultimately allowing them the opportunity to take the text and to meditate and return to me if they'd like to continue that conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Rabbi Glazer Wartzman.
I appreciate what Rabbi Karen and Rabbi Mangel have both said. And I would say that while this is a pastoral issue, and we are all called upon to be first responders in these moments of deep, deep trauma that are emerging, the tension between secular law and Jewish law is a much larger conversation. And on one foot, I would just say that it's very clear that Judaism has survived all of its host cultures in which we have been living in those lands because of the concept of Dina de Malchuta Dina, which we don't want to hear right now, especially in our current state, because it limits freedom. That is to say, we must follow the law of the land. We must be law-abiding citizens. That is a Jewish ethic, to be a responsible citizen. But to be a responsible citizen within a democracy also means that it's important to educate, to advocate, and to protest, and to ensure that we're doing that in whatever way we respond to the tasks ahead of us. We do that from a place of informed Jewish values, and that we don't allow it to divide the Jewish community and to divide our families. And as I mentioned at the top of the discussion, the issue that Rabbi Karen brought up in terms of the overall trauma and the sense of shame that already is kind of a cloud hanging over these discussions now just becomes exacerbated because we're in a situation where we can make a pastoral recommendation based on the context where a woman should go forward to terminate the pregnancy, and now she's going to have to go out of state, or she's going to have to order abortion pills through the internet, and she's going to be surveilled as a criminal. So the secular legal implications of what a religious pastoral counsel gives to a family is going to leave us in a place where we can't complete our work, and we're going to be seeing families coming back to us with additional trauma. And I would even dare say, in a more provocative way, that legislation that bars, from a secular perspective, the ability for pastoral psychiatry and for rabbinic advice to be able to give women the freedom to be able to make choices that are part of their religion actually borders on being anti-Semitic legislation.
Okay, thank you. We have a last question for Bonnie before we go to our many questions being asked by our attendees. Bonnie, how might a legal claim be framed to account for the Jewish perspective? We just saw the Florida case. How do we frame that? How do we?
Before I address that, let me just state that in the Dobbs case, which was just decided, they overturned Roe, and they held that there was no constitutional right for a woman to choose an abortion. And they sent that issue back to the states. So that was a pretty significant decision. And I think really to understand it, you have to understand two different theories of constitutional interpretation, which I won't go to now, but I think that is an underlying basis for the decision in Dobbs. The Florida case that you talked about is really very interesting. In 1980, the Florida Constitution was amended, and it was amended to guarantee a very broad right of privacy, which was explicitly stated. Unlike in Roe, there was an implied right of privacy in the Constitution. This was explicitly put in the Florida Constitution. After that, the Florida Supreme Court upheld a privacy right, and it said that it includes the right to terminate a pregnancy. Then in 2012, the state tried to pass a referendum which would narrow that privacy right, and the citizens of Florida voted that down resoundingly. So now the state Florida legislature has passed a bill that criminalizes abortion after 15 weeks, which is pre-viability, and it penalizes people who willfully perform or participate in an abortion. And there have been some cases where willfully perform or participate, which is very vague, could include rabbinic counseling. So it's something that we all need to certainly pay attention to. So a suit was filed by a congregation in Florida, and some of the contentions that they have made in their lawsuit are that that a woman's right to privacy under the state constitution has been violated by the state law, that because it reflects not a Jewish view of when life begins, but reflects the view that life begins at conception, that it violates the separation of church and state, that it's certainly void for vagueness, because how do you define who has willfully performed or actively participated? And in addition to that, it it violates the Establishment Clause, because if it's using a definition of when life begins, which is at conception, that is not our views. It also has a chilling effect on our free exercise of our religion in trying to follow our Jewish laws, which contradict the state law. So it's a suit that's been filed, and I know we'll all be watching with interest. And that's how they have formalized some of the complaints against the state law.
Thank you. And I know we're at the time for Q&A, but I just want to ask if any of the rabbis want to respond to Bonnie. Yes, Rabbi Glazer, Wartzman.
Well, I really appreciate your nuanced parsing, Bonnie, and I know I'm going to look forward to learning a lot more from you about reading constitutional law, but I think you hit the nail on the head, which is if we are supposed to be living in a democracy where we have the freedom to be able to practice our religion, when the rubber hits the road, this raises major issues for us as law-abiding Jews and respectful citizens within a state where we no longer are able to freely practice our religion. And it's fascinating because these are not new questions. There's a famous sugya in the Talmud where Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi and Antoninus, the Roman emperor, are going back and forth about this issue. And what underlies this issue is not just theology, which seems to have been sort of bracketed about the question of when life begins, but really of power and powerlessness. And throughout history, as Jews, we have always been powerless until the refounding of the state of Israel, in which we have a sense of sovereignty, and those issues come to the forefront when you marry church and state, or we would call synagogue and state. So there's things to look at, both in terms of the precedent that's going to be set by the resolution of this lawsuit that thankfully the Florida congregation filed, and I think there's going to be more of them that are going to be emerging, and it's going to change the landscape of of American religiosity in terms of what does it mean to actually be able to freely practice one's religion without a sense of coercion or discrimination. I think we should all be extremely concerned. We're not legislators here. We're not experts in secular law. Bonnie, Marcy, you're the experts here, so you'll translate it and you'll help us understand it, translate it into the pastoral implications and the Jewish implications. But we want to be law-abiding citizens, and we also want to be able to protect and to serve our families and the women who come to us for counsel, and to relieve them from trauma and to allow them to be able to have that freedom, which is a cornerstone within Judaism. And I just want to revise one thing that I said earlier relating to the Tzitz Eliezer, because it may have offended some people, and I wanted to apologize. I agree with what Rabbi Mangel had said regarding the Tesak situation, and the language of the Tzitz Eliezer in the Hebrew, he does speak about a Baal Mum or a Baal Yisurim, suggesting that if the fetus in some way is not completely formed in terms of its viability, or if it is in a state of constant pain. That was what I was referring to, and I didn't want to offend anyone's sensibility by using the language of deformed, which was a poor translation choice on my part. So please forgive me for that misspoken moment.
Thank you. Rabbi Mangel, you wanted to add something quickly?
Yes. When we talk about our obligation to follow the law of the land, that is not absolute. There are limits. That is only when it is dealing with non-religious or ritual law. And here would be an interesting question, that if there would be a ban for all abortions for any reason at any given time, would we be obligated to follow that? So that would be an interesting question. Bonnie, I would like to ask you one question. Is there any state today that bans an abortion even if the life of the mother is in danger?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't reviewed all the state laws. There are some, I believe there are some states that do not have any exceptions. They ban abortion and there are no exceptions made. So I think the answer to that is yes. I can't tell you which states, but
Even for the life of the mother?
Yes.
it's my understanding. And
Mississippi.
That means
I
there's
think
no
it's-
exceptions whatsoever?
Which is why women have to go elsewhere.
No,
But,
I'm asking if the life of the mother is in danger and a doctor would say that. Would you?
We'll
Because I
have to
think
get
that
back.
that would be part of the conversation that would be interesting to me, because I think that one thing that I think that we all agree on, that we're talking about abortion when the life of the mother is in danger, which would be where we all agree that it should be necessary, and Judaism would expect that and say that it is a mitzvah to have an abortion if the life of the mother is in danger. So now, if there would be a state that would say under no circumstances, that would be an issue that I think that we will all agree that is of a concern to Judaism.
And I think
If
that's
there's no
one of the
exceptions.
nuances.
What?
That's one of the nuances. How do we define, and how is it defined by the states as to
Right.
life of a mother?
Right.
And this goes to one of the questions that came from one of our attendees. Under Jewish law, is a woman's life limited to death-related situations, or is it broad enough to address psychological issues? And because we also hear about rape and incest, I'm not ready to raise a child. And in my personal case, of not knowing that my son had heart disease in utero. So again, that nuance of how do we determine the life of a mother? So who wants to take that one on? Rabbi Badney Hallis. Thank you.
There was one text that I thought would be important to bring up to this question, which was a response by Rabbi Jacob Emden, where the question is regarding an adulterous married woman who is pregnant, who the context is that the rabbis are giving the permission for her to abort. And in the case of it, it says that even in the case of a legitimate fetus, there is reason to be lenient if there is a great need, as long as the fetus has not begun to emerge, even if the mother's life is not in jeopardy, but also so as to save her from woe associated with it that would cause her great pain. That's not to say that any woe then is able to be considered as reason, but it does open up, again, that window for discussion and, talking about issues that are, as we said, more individual, more nuanced, and directly related to mental health, I believe.
Thank you. Anyone else want? Rabbi Mangel and then Rabbi Glazer.
Rabbi Glazer, you can go first.
Well, I just wanted to pick up, thank you, Rabbi Mangel, on what Rabbi Karen said in that response of Emden in the Sheila Yavetz. It's very clear that the language is vague, and it's intentionally vague to allow rabbinic pastoring to happen, right? When you talk about ke'ev gadol, how can you measure what a great pain is in terms of the psychological impact and trauma that in this extreme case a woman would be undergoing? And that's something that happens, as we said, in the context of the rabbi study when you're counseling a family and when you're speaking with the mother. The range of trauma and the range of this kind of psychological impact of ke'ev, of pain, is something that we have to be deeply, deeply sensitized to, and that all the rabbis on this call, I would say, specialists in. We are empaths, and we are deeply sensitive to the pain of others. And our role and our calling is to try to find some way to be able to be healers of the brokenness that we experience in the world. And so the keen sensitivity that we try to display at all times is something that I would hope would allow us to be as empathic and as involved and really as present as possible to the pain that and the trauma that the person before us, in this case the mother, and the family may be experiencing. And that's why I appreciated so much, Rabbi Mangel, earlier on, you said that you really need to be consulting with a team of professionals. So it's not just the doctor, but it's also the psychologist, right? To really try to understand the impact and to understand that this is a moment within a continuum of a family life, and that it doesn't begin and end, as you said jokingly, when you go to college, but that trauma is something that if it's not dealt with, you carry forward. And so it's really important to understand. We can try to delineate, is it 40 days, is it 80 days, is it 3 months? But that's not really the ultimate issue. It's an issue of burning concern for the freedom of reproductive rights. But the trauma is something that lasts much longer. And we are dedicated to working with our community, with our congregants, and we care to be able to alleviate and to support the trauma that they're going through, and that is only being exacerbated by these situations now.
Thank you. Rabbi Mangel, and then
Yes.
and then we're going to have to close it off.
So what I see here, that we are all saying that there are no blanket statements, that every situation and every person and every family and every issue must be considered as individuals, and you have to consider all the ramifications and all of the sources in order to come to a decision. And it is this nuance that is so necessary. We live in a world that it is about slogans and statements, and one size fits all. That is not Judaism. In Judaism, there is a lot of room for the nuance, to look at the different texts and consider the individuals involved, and with their rabbi and with their professionals, with the doctors, to make the proper decision for that family.
Wow. I'm just, this has been an amazing conversation, and I can't thank each of you enough. Yasher Kochim to all of our panelists this evening. May you have strength. And in that strength, our community grows. This was so important to have this conversation for all of us to learn, and to learn together as a Jewish community, because with our knowledge, we can go forward and we can make informed decisions, and we can share those decisions with others. JCRC is about education and advocacy and action, and what we do together and what we do next is crucial, and it's crucial that we stay together in this. We started, I have to tell you all, with 88 participants, and we're ending with 86. So that to me says a lot about this conversation together. I thank you. It has been a pleasure serving you over the past 2 years, but I will continue to say lahitraot. Thank you so much. Chen, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and special thanks to our panelists. And I would like to say that there are ways to be involved if you are interested, and please call the Federation offices and you can ask to speak with me, and I will be happy to add you guys to our JCRC mail list. And we can also have a conversation about your interests and what your interests are, and if you want to participate in any committee. And with that being said, thank you very much for everyone, and have a good night.
Thanks so much. Yeshua to everybody.
And
God
Shabbat
bless. Stay
Shalom.
safe and sound. Shabbat Shalom. Great to be together.